Fort Smith, Arkansas, built on blood, ruled by the noose. This river town is where the Wild West truly died, and its violent ghosts still demand justice. From the old fort to the final gallows drop, we counted down the top 15 haunted places in Fort Smith you won't survive ignoring. 1. Fort Smith National Historic Site, Fort Smith. The air inside the fortified walls of Fort Smith National Historic Site is thick, not with dust, but with the sediment of human despair. The stone barracks and the reconstructed gallows loom under the perpetual gray sky of the Arkansas River borderland. Investigators often note the sharp, sudden drops in temperature that defy thermodynamics, chilling the bone even on the hottest summer nights. A cold that seems to cling to the memory of misery and final judgment. This ground bore witness to the iron fist of law and order on the treacherous American frontier. For decades, the site housed the courthouse where Judge Isaac C. Parker, the notorious hanging judge, presided over justice in the largest federal jurisdiction in history. Over 70 men were marched from their confinement to the custom-built gallows located just behind the courthouse, their lives terminated by the rope for crimes committed in the vast, lawless expanse of Indian Territory. The residual emotional charge of those executions is palpable, leaving echoes of panic and righteous fury embedded in the very foundations of the old buildings. The most specific activity centers around the confinement areas and the preserved jail structures. Guards and historical interpreters consistently report the sound of shuffling feet and the distant, rhythmic clang of iron on stone, originating from unoccupied wings of the facility. One recurring phenomenon frequently documented is the apparition of a tall, dark figure seen pacing the upper walkway of the fort. Some theorize this is the spectral remnant of a nameless marshal still patrolling his defunct violent beat. More disturbing, electronic voice phenomena EVP recordings frequently capture desperate, truncated whispers, names being called, and the chilling, repeated plea, "Wait for me." To walk the grounds after midnight is to risk becoming an involuntary witness to the brutality of the past. The spirits here are not benign remnants. They are the restless dead, tethered to the precise spot where their final hope expired. Fort Smith is a monument built atop a foundation of finalized suffering, and the condemned refuse to rest. 2. Clayton House, Fort Smith. The massive Italianate architecture of the Clayton House in Fort Smith holds the humidity and the silence of the 19th century. Its foundations, laid in 1882, support more than just the three-story structure. They anchor a profound sense of loss that permeates the property even today. It was the residence of William Henry Harrison Clayton, a prominent U.S. attorney whose success was tragically cut short. Clayton died unexpectedly in 1889, leaving his wife, Julia, and his children to navigate the vast, empty rooms, a grief that seems to have fossilized within the wainscoting and plaster. For decades, documented accounts from caretakers, historians, and guests have focused on the palpable presence of Julia Clayton, the steadfast matriarch who outlived her husband and much of her family within those walls. The phenomena are subtle but relentless. Visitors frequently report sharp temperature drops in the main parlor, often accompanied by the distinct, heavy fragrance of pipe tobacco. Though no smoking is permitted, in the master bedroom, doors that were verified as bolted shut have been found inexplicably ajar, suggesting a restless energy determined to bypass physical constraints. However, the most unnerving recurrence involves the grand piano situated in the formal dining room. Investigators have recorded faint, yet distinct, melodies emanating from the instrument late-at-night music that ceases abruptly if anyone approaches the threshold. On one particularly cold evening, a curator observed a shadow near the piano bench, too solid to be moonlight, manifesting momentarily as a slender woman in period dress, her head bowed in sorrow. It is the persistent belief of those who work there, that Julia Clayton remains eternally vigilant, a silent, sorrowful resident guarding the echo of a life that ended too soon, forever trapped in the elegant solitude of her home. Three, Miss Laura's Social Club, Fort Smith. The air inside the Queen Anne structure in Fort Smith, known locally as Miss Laura's, never truly circulates. It is thick with the scent of old velvet, dust, and something indefinable, something that clings like residual sorrow, now preserved as a museum. The house operated as the sole recognized brothel in Arkansas until 1911, a place where transactions were sealed in silence. The original brass doorknobs feel perpetually cold to the touch, a subtle warning that not all occupants have departed, and that the history here is not merely decorative. Local historians document the era under Miss Laura Ziegler's strict management, but the official records skip over the true unpleasantness. The dominant legend focuses on a young woman named Elsie, whose tuberculosis was neglected until it consumed her in the small, locked parlor on the second floor. Her final days were marked by desperate, low coughing fits that the other girls were trained to ignore, so as not to disrupt the business flow downstairs. Elsie's story is not a romantic tragedy, but rather an administrative oversight that created a perpetual, agonizing resonance within the building's framework. The most consistent paranormal reports center around the late-night closing staff. Cold spots frequently cluster around the third-floor linen closet, areas far colder than ambient temperature suggests, suggesting a deliberate draining of localized energy. Electronic recording devices often capture faint, rhythmic scratching noises emanating from behind the wainscoting in the former blue room, like fingernails against plaster. Crucially, a heavy, dated rose perfume, which Miss Laura herself notoriously despised, will spontaneously bloom in the main hallway, only to vanish instantly, leaving behind a sharp, acrid smell of iron. The entities inhabiting Miss Laura's are not guests. They are permanent fixtures bound by the economic reality of their lives. They do not seek attention, but merely continue their routines. When the main doors are locked at 5 p.m., the security personnel routinely listen for the unmistakable, subtle sound of a high-heeled shoe tapping across the uncarpeted floor of the locked reception room, marking the commencement of a shift that will never truly end. Fort Smith Museum of History. Fort Smith. The air inside the Fort Smith Museum of History is heavy, with the dust of forgotten legal skirmishes and lost frontier ambitions. When the main doors lock and the surveillance lights flicker on, the silence is not empty, it is pressurized, holding back the voices of the past, particularly those silenced too soon by the long shadow of the federal court. This institution, a repository of Arkansas's rugged history, houses relics that hold emotional, sometimes volatile, energy. The epicenter of this residual dread is the small display dedicated to the turbulent era of Judge Isaac Parker's jurisdiction. Among the preserved ledgers and weaponry is a single, tarnished leather satchel, allegedly recovered from a petty criminal executed by hanging in the 1880s. A man who swore his innocence with his final, rasping breath. Curators acknowledge that the exhibit does not merely house a historical item. It appears to contain the residual, furious sorrow of the condemned. Staff reports consistently note a significant drop in ambient temperature around the satchel's case, often by 10 degrees. Regardless of the building's climate control, the hauntings escalated from simple cold spots to verifiable auditory phenomena. Security logs detail multiple instances of overnight guards abandoning their posts after hearing hushed, gravelly whispers emanating from the exhibit hall, sounds that employees interpret as a muffled, suffocated plea. "It was never mine." More unsettling are the reviewed camera feeds showing the unmistakable impression of a heavy, dragging footprint appearing on the carpet near the display, only to fade within seconds of its manifestation. Curators now treat the small leather satchel with nervous reverence, recognizing they are not merely preserving an artifact of the Western District Court, but housing a permanent, enraged resident. The man may have been silent on the gallows, but his spectral indignation still vibrates through the locked glass, a constant, chilling reminder that justice sometimes fails, and the dead never truly leave their evidence behind. Five, Fort Smith Trolley Museum, Fort Smith. The air inside the car barn at the Fort Smith Trolley Museum carries a distinct odor, ozone, dust, and the deep, cold scent of abandoned steel. When the massive wooden doors are sealed for the night, the silence is not empty. It is weighted by the presence of dormant machinery and, allegedly, by lingering passengers who never reach their final stop. These preserved streetcars, particularly the hulking dark green Car 224, sit like metallic coffins waiting for a procession that ended decades ago. Yet the staff maintains that some part of the line remains perpetually open for those who cannot rest. Local historians often point to the devastating derailment of 1927 as the genesis of the museum's reputation. During a torrential downpour, a loaded evening car lost its brakes on Garrison Avenue, resulting in several fatalities as the heavy vehicle overturned. The specific legend claims that the motorman, unable to prevent the catastrophe, haunts the museum grounds. Eternally attempting to halt his doomed run, he is said to manifest as a sudden, sharp dip in temperature around the maintenance pit, followed by the faint but unmistakable sound of a trolley bell ringing once, then abruptly cutting off, a sound no working system could possibly emit in the dead of night. The most documented paranormal activity centers specifically on Car 224, a vehicle that bears an unnerving resemblance to the one involved in the 27 incident. Security logs routinely document doors found ajar immediately after they were locked and sealed by closing personnel. Staff have repeatedly reported seeing deep, permanent-looking impressions on the velvet seats of the conductor's station, as if a heavy body has just momentarily risen, even when the power to the barn is completely disconnected. Furthermore, electrical surges are a common complaint, isolated only to the interior wiring of this specific car, causing the sickly yellow lights inside to flicker with a terrifying, rhythmic persistence long after the main breaker has been thrown. The most profound dread, however, comes from the occasional, fleeting observation made during early morning checks. The reflection of a man in a greasy uniform, peering through the high, arched windows of the car barn, his face obscured by shadow and condensation. Before anyone can react or confirm the figure, the reflection vanishes, leaving only the silent, cold metal, waiting for the rails to call the spectral crew back to their dark circuit. Six, Belle Grove Historic District, Fort Smith. The air over Belle Grove, Fort Smith, hangs thick with the scent of aged cedar and forgotten lavender. Gaslights, though replaced by modern electric replicas, cast shadows that stretch and warp, hinting at the specters clinging to the district's grand Victorian mansions. This is not a place where the past whispers. It screams through leaded glass and elaborate gingerbread trim. Every impeccably maintained facade is a gilded cage holding the memory of high society and sudden, sharp tragedy, a stark reminder that preservation only applies to the wood and brick, not the anguished souls who once inhabited them. The district flourished in the late 19th century, a testament to post-war prosperity. Yet that prosperity offered no effective shield against the epidemics and infant mortality that swept through Arkansas. Legend holds that many of the homes, particularly those lining May and G Streets, still contain the emotional residue of these abrupt losses. The grand staircases, once pathways to social triumph, often became the final descent for bodies prepared for burial. Victims of consumption or scarlet fever, the ghosts here are not vague historical figures, but the lingering presence of those who never completed their lives, their residual terror echoing in the hollow silence. Investigators report consistent anomalies that defy physical explanation within several of the restored properties. In the parlor rooms of multiple residences, the distinct, chilling echo of a music box playing a tune unknown to the current era is frequently documented, always fading just as the listener approaches the source. More unnerving are the localized thermal spikes recorded in upstairs nurseries, often accompanied by the heavy, rhythmic sound of a rocking chair that remains physically motionless. This specific phenomenon suggests a protective, yet deeply sorrowful, maternal presence. Trapped in an unending vigil over cribs long empty, Belle Grove remains a living museum. But the exhibits are not merely the antiques and the architecture. They are the emotions sealed into the mortar, the grief woven into the fabric of the high-backed chairs. To walk these streets after midnight is to understand that the past in Fort Smith is not something researched. It is something felt, a cold, immutable pressure, asserting that the former residents of Belle Grove have never and will never check out. Seven, Oak Cemetery, Fort Smith. Oak Cemetery in Fort Smith, established in 1841, is less a burial ground and more a register of frontier suffering. Its narrow paths wind through tilted marble and sandstone effigies, monuments to lives that ended abruptly, soldiers, pioneers, and victims of mid-19th century fever. The air here, even on the warmest Arkansas afternoon, carries a distinct, pervasive chill, attributed by parapsychologists to the sheer concentration of sorrow accumulated over nearly 2 centuries of loss. The uneven terrain is covered by the shadows of ancient oaks, filtering light onto markers that bear witness to the desperate mortality rate of the early settlement years. The site's most documented tragedy centers on the oldest, walled-off section, rumored to contain dozens of unmarked graves from a Civil War-era influenza outbreak. It is here that the recurring manifestation known locally as the Lady in Black is most frequently reported. The legend describes her as the inconsolable widow of a Confederate surgeon, perpetually searching for her husband's remains, which were misplaced or buried anonymously during the chaos of the war's close. Eyewitness accounts emphasize that she is silent, moving only in peripheral vision, draped in heavy, outdated mourning attire that seems to absorb the available moonlight. Investigators conducting nocturnal surveillance routinely record drastic temperature drops up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit when approaching the large iron mausoleum adjacent to the older field. Furthermore, advanced electronic voice phenomena (EVP) sessions have captured distinct low-frequency sounds identified by linguistic analysts not as discernible speech, but as rhythmic, distressed exhaling the sound of profound, unrelenting weeping. Security personnel often cite incidents where their handheld radios suddenly broadcast static mixed with this deep, guttural sound, forcing immediate abandonment of the patrol route due to severe, localized psychological distress. Oak Cemetery is not simply haunted by a single ghost, but saturated by grief. The Lady in Black may be the epicenter, but the echoes of the countless unmarked dead lend a terrible permanence to the site. The sorrow, researchers conclude, is structural, a deep resonance of the earth itself, perpetually confirming that for some souls interred here, the frontier life they fought to establish remains a desolate, unfinished business, eternally bound to the shadow of the weeping oak. Eight, Creekmore Park, Fort Smith. Creekmore Park, by daylight, is a sanctuary of laughter and the gentle hiss of the miniature train's steam engine. After dusk, however, the atmosphere thickens into something palpable and suffocating. The air cools sharply near the old stone pavilion, even on the hottest Arkansas nights, and the playground equipment often sways with an invisible momentum long after the last child has gone home. This is not simply residual energy. It is a manifestation tied specifically to the land's brutal history, a chilling reminder of the suffering that predates the modern amenities. Local lore suggests the park grounds were once part of a communal farmstead abandoned during a catastrophic influenza outbreak in the early 1920s. The historical record centers on a young caretaker named Elias Shaw, tasked with the impossible job of burying the deceased when local services were overwhelmed. Shaw worked until he too succumbed. The legend holds that he died alone in the old utility pump house, consumed by fever and the terrible guilt of duties left incomplete. His final resting place marked by nothing more than the earth he struggled to turn. The resulting spectral activity is consistent and unnerving. Security staff have documented repeated incidents of the miniature train whistle sounding spontaneously around 2:00 a.m., always a single, mournful blast despite the engine being cold and secured. More disturbing are the encounters near the pavilion restroom facilities. Witnesses report hearing faint, frantic coughing emanating from the locked stalls, accompanied by a strong, medicinal odor reminiscent of camphor and decay. If investigators unlock the doors, the sound immediately ceases, leaving the small room intensely, inexplicably cold. Elias Shaw, trapped in his feverish final moments, seems unable to abandon his eternal post or the memory of the dead he was meant to protect. Those who linger too late often report seeing a shadow figure tall and gaunt, clad in faded overalls walking the perimeter of the playground before simply dissolving into the deep shadows beneath the ancient oaks. He is not malevolent, witnesses affirm, merely exhausted, forever searching the dry dirt of Creekmore Park for a shovel he can no longer lift. Nine, St. Scholastica Monastery, Fort Smith. The silence that blankets the grounds of St. Scholastica Monastery in Fort Smith is not peaceful. It is a profound, suffocating void, broken only by the whispers carried on the Arkansas wind. Built as a sanctuary, the sprawling, historic stone structure now holds a quiet dread, particularly in the older, cloistered wings where the light struggles to penetrate the stained glass. The air within these halls is perpetually cool, heavy with the scent of aged incense and something else, a metallic tang that lingers long after the sun has set. The legend centers on Sister Beatrice, a nun of the Benedictine order who lived within the monastery walls in the early 20th century. While most sisters found solace in devotion, Beatrice was reportedly consumed by a deep, unnamed melancholy, a spiritual darkness that the rigorous monastic life failed to dispel. She was found one frigid morning in the convent's rarely used infirmary, a tragedy that the order quickly and quietly contained, citing an accident. But the truth, whispered among local historians, suggests a more deliberate, desperate ending. The order's attempts to purify the space were futile. Beatrice's despair had etched itself into the very bedrock of the building. The manifestation of Sister Beatrice is subtle but relentless. Her presence is most acutely felt in the long, tiled corridor outside the old refectory, where witnesses report a precipitous drop in temperature, followed by the faint, rhythmic shuffling of sandals on stone, a sound utterly distinct from the heavy boots of modern maintenance staff. Electrical disturbances plague the area. Lights flicker and die, not due to faulty wiring, but often preceding the sound of a distant, faint sob, muffled as if through thick wool. The most disturbing accounts involve the vision of a woman's silhouette, dark and stooped, momentarily cast upon the wall when no physical person stands near the window. A fleeting shadow of perpetual sorrow refusing to pass into light. Even now, decades after the monastery transitioned into other uses, those who work within the silent edifice maintain a strict policy of never walking the corridor alone after midnight. They understand that Sister Beatrice remains a spectral resident defined by her final, profound unhappiness, forever pacing the length of her eternal confinement, searching for a peace that Saint Scholastica could never offer her in life or death. Then, West End Park. Fort Smith. West End Park in Fort Smith feels distinctly different after the streetlights click off. It's a vast, poorly lit space bordered by high, dark oaks, where the air often carries a pervasive chill regardless of the season. Even midday visitors comment on the strange pressure that builds around the park's central, ornate iron fence line, a section that seems to absorb all light and sound. Creating a dead spot where laughter fades into stillness, local history is quick to celebrate the park's recreational features, but avoids the darker foundation upon which the green space rests. The park's origins hold a grim, often ignored history dating back to the late 1890s. Before it was officially designated a community space, the area was the site of a tragic municipal disaster. A partially collapsed underground cistern intended to supply the burgeoning city's water. During construction, a rapid structural failure buried an unknown number of workers in mud, rock, and fractured concrete. Records suggest several bodies were never fully recovered, their resting places cemented beneath the sprawling lawns in a hasty attempt to cover the incident and allow the park development to proceed quickly. The residual energy of that loss manifests in unnervingly specific, claustrophobic ways. Visitors often report hearing the faint sound of grinding stone and wet, muffled hammering emanating directly from the ground beneath the old swing set area, sometimes accompanied by the faint, desperate echo of someone calling out water. Investigators using thermal imaging near the park's main historical marker have recorded localized drops of 40 degrees, sometimes revealing fleeting heat signatures consistent with an adult human frame struggling just below the soil line. The most notorious manifestation involves the lone gas lamp near the park's maintenance shed, which flickers violently around 3:00 a.m., illuminating a spectral figure described as perpetually coated in thick, slick mud, standing motionless before dissolving back into the earth. These phenomena are not playful, they are consistent, oppressive signatures of trapped sorrow. Those who remain in the park past midnight often leave reporting a profound sense of exhaustion and suffocation, as if the soil itself is pressing down on their chests, forcing them to share the agonizing, panicked end of the forgotten laborers still struggling to break through the concrete shell of West End Park. Chaffee Barbershop Museum, Fort Smith. The air inside the Chaffee Barbershop Museum is thick and cloying, smelling faintly of disinfectant and old pomade, scents left over from the thousands of required haircuts administered here during the fort's active years. This small, preserved structure, where countless young recruits sat nervously awaiting their regulation buzz cuts, holds a palpable tension, the distilled anxiety of men preparing for wars they might not survive. The atmosphere is less one of tragedy and more one of stagnant, inescapable waiting. Historians and paranormal investigators believe this profound residual stress contributes heavily to the building's unnerving activity. The central legend involves a specific recruit, a young man rumored to have died by accident on the grounds in 1952, just days before his deployment to Korea. His final hours of certainty were spent in the barbershop chair, his last memory being the cold steel of the shears at his neck. His restlessness, witnesses suggest, is rooted in the routine he was forced to complete just moments before his meaningless end. The manifestations are subtle but terrifyingly specific. Curators consistently report inexplicable movements of the ancient instruments. Scissors stored securely in glass cases are often found partially open or slightly skewed. Visitors standing near the third chair, which remains mysteriously ice-cold even in midsummer, have reported hearing faint, rapid clicking sounds, like the hurried snip of phantom blades against air. The shop's vast mirrored wall is the most active zone. Several documented accounts claim that when the room is empty, A brief, terrified reflection of a pale, regulation-cropped young man can be seen momentarily overlaid on the viewer's own image. The ghost of the barbershop is not malicious. He is simply stuck in the moment of permanent transition. He is the eternal recruit, forever waiting for the chair to spin, the haircut complete, and the order to march out, trapped in the final civilian routine before a war that ended decades ago. Sure. Tills Park, Fort Smith. The air in Tills Park, after the sun dips below the bluff, is a peculiar mix of damp earth and something metallic, like old pennies. Most visitors, preoccupied with the playground or the tennis courts, never notice the shift in temperature near the south fence line, particularly around the remnants of the old water retention pond. It is here, locals whisper, that the park's veneer of suburban recreation thins, exposing the dark history of the land. Once the site of a chaotic squatter camp in the late 19th century, a series of sudden, unseasonal floods plagued the area, and during the particularly brutal winter of 1888, several families, displaced and desperate, simply vanished into the swollen, muddy currents that cut across the acreage. The most persistent spectral claim involves a figure known only as the Water Ghost, rumored to be a young woman who drowned while trying to save her child during one of those sudden deluges. Park maintenance crews have documented baffling occurrences that defy logical explanation. Tools vanish from locked sheds only to reappear waterlogged. Miles from the park boundary, more unnerving are the auditory disturbances, the distinct, wet sound of someone struggling to breathe, always emanating from dry ground. Often near the gazebo when no one is present, security footage occasionally captures a brief, shimmering distortion near the base of the massive oak tree by the pavilion, a movement too fluid and too swift to be a person or an animal. However, the haunting escalates dramatically when the park is empty and a dense fog rolls in from the Arkansas River. Late-night dog walkers or police patrols report seeing a vague, translucent outline hovering just above the lowest cut of grass, a silhouette that seems perpetually dripping, though the ground is dry if approached. The apparition does not flee, rather, witnesses describe an overwhelming sensation of cold, penetrating bone deep, followed by the terrifying, fleeting image of pale, grasping hands rising from the dirt, as if trying to pull themselves free from a shallow, muddy grave. Those who linger too close to the southern boundary fence after midnight often feel a pressure, a sudden weight settling upon their chest, accompanied by the faint, desolate cry of a mother searching for what she lost in the mud. Tills Park is not just a recreational area, it is a repository for tragedy, where the dead remain trapped beneath the well-manicured lawn, eternally struggling against the watery oblivion that claimed them so long ago. Sure, son. Bonneville House, Fort Smith. The old Bonneville House stands on the outskirts of Fort Smith, a monument to stifled opulence. The air here always feels thick, regardless of the season, a suffocating blanket of history and humid decay, built just after the Civil War. Its stately Southern Gothic profile is now characterized by peeling paint and shuttered windows that seem to watch the road with blind resentment. Locals rarely approach after dusk, citing a perpetual, bone-deep cold that radiates from the structure, a tangible barrier between the living and the events sealed within the plaster and brick. The primary account centers on Eleanor Bonneville, the wife of the original owner, Colonel Isaac Bonneville. Eleanor died in the master bedroom in 1878, following a prolonged and agonizing illness. Local lore suggests her death was not peaceful. She was buried wearing the voluminous black mourning dress she had refused to take off. Even in her final feverish delirium, the house, witnesses claim, absorbed the raw grief of that period. Investigators have frequently documented the sounds of a woman weeping softly on the second-floor landing, always accompanied by a faint, metallic scent sometimes interpreted as old blood. sometimes as heavy perfume. The manifestations are specific and cyclical. A key phenomenon involves the master bedroom fireplace. Even in high summer, the hearth registers dramatically low temperatures, often 5 degrees below ambient norms. Crucially, the dragging sound of heavy silk or taffeta traversing the hardwood floor is reported precisely at 3:15 a.m., the time Eleanor's death certificate recorded her passing. More disturbing are the visual reports. A fleeting, tall shadow often seen traversing the length of the darkened, arched hallway on the main floor. When confronted, the shadow does not dissipate. It simply turns, facing the witness, before retreating into the deeper darkness of the storage cellar. The house is not merely haunted by an echo, but by a presence trapped in ritualistic suffering. Modern electromagnetic field sweeps often max out in the unoccupied spaces, and audio recordings capture whispers that refuse clear translation, save for one recurring sharp sound, a shallow, desperate gasp. The collective evidence suggests that Eleanor Bonneville never left her earthly confinement in Fort Smith, and the house remains an architectural mausoleum, continuously replaying the final, suffocating moments of her demise. Marshals Museum, Fort Smith. The air around Fort Smith always carries a metallic scent, cold and sharp, like old iron handcuffs left forgotten in the rain. Before the U.S. Marshals Museum existed, the ground held the infamous gallows known as the Cradle, where Judge Isaac Parker, the hanging judge, dispensed a brutal justice that echoed far beyond the Arkansas riverbanks. When the massive glass and steel structure finally rose, it wasn't just built upon history, it was built upon the restless, angry sediment of the condemned. Staff working late often speak of the Hall of Honor, where the exhibits dedicated to fallen marshals suddenly feel less like memorials and more like watchtowers. The official history speaks of bravery and the law, but the shadow history murmurs of the 57 men Parker sent to the rope, some of whom may have been innocent, their appeals lost in the fog of frontier expediency. It is these residual energies, the injustice of sudden, final death, that seem to cling to the high ceilings. The specific hauntings rarely involve apparitions, but focus instead on a relentless manipulation of time and gravity. Displayed badges in locked cases have been found rotated 180 degrees, facing away from the viewer. The most unnerving phenomenon occurs in the lower archives, a cold room dedicated to the records of the executed. Security cameras sometimes capture faint, deep indentations pressing inward on the carpet, suggesting a heavy weight settling or perhaps a desperate, final struggle against the pull of a noose. The pressure points move slowly, invisibly, tracking a path that terminates directly beneath a framed photograph of Judge Parker's stone-cold gaze. Curators refuse to call it a haunting, preferring to catalog the disturbances as environmental anomalies. But late one night, a janitor swore he heard a deep, rattling cough emanating from the exhibit dedicated to Bill Doolin's gang, followed by the sickening, wet sound of a neck snapping, a sound so crisp and final it could only be a memory replaying itself, locked forever inside the institution, dedicated to the very law that silenced them. The silence that follows is not peaceful, but heavy with the weight of unpardoned souls. The Darby House, Fort Smith. The shadow cast by the Darby House on Fort Smith's historic 14th Street is not merely structural, it is historical. This massive, stately home, built in the Queen Anne style, exudes a heavy silence that seems to absorb the sounds of the modern world. Visitors often report a profound chill the moment they cross the threshold, an unnatural drop in temperature localized near the central staircase. Regardless of the season, it is a structure meticulously maintained but irrevocably broken by the lingering presence of those who died within its ornate walls. The psychic energy is largely attributed to the initial owners, particularly Mrs. Eleanor Darby. Historical records show that Eleanor suffered a protracted illness in the late 1910s, dying slowly on the third-floor landing, a location she allegedly dragged herself to in a futile attempt to signal help after her nurses abandoned her shift. The legend states that her final, desperate moments imprinted themselves violently upon the oak flooring. Subsequent tenants reported that the atmosphere shifted dramatically after dark, specifically sensing an acute, oppressive sorrow radiating from the upper floors where the death occurred. Investigators catalog a specific set of repeating phenomena. The most common is the faint, unmistakable scent of lavender and old lilac perfume, which abruptly manifests and dissipates in the second-floor master suite. Auditory phenomena include the sound of heavy furniture being scraped across the bare wood floorboards upstairs. Even when the house is verified as empty, crucially, the spirit of Eleanor Darby is consistently identified by a dragging sound, a slow, labored movement consistent with someone struggling to pull their own weight across the landing, usually culminating in a soft, final thud at the top of the stairs. The Darby House does not rage, it grieves eternally. Those who have slept overnight confirm that the activity peaks around 3:00 a.m., the recorded time of Eleanor's passing. The tragedy is not merely that she died, but that her struggle remains perpetually looping, a sorrowful, documented haunting that refuses the quiet dignity of rest and demands witness from the living. That's our chilling countdown of the top 15 haunted places in Fort Smith. If these stories sent a shiver down your spine, hit the like button, subscribe for more ghostly content, and leave a comment below telling us which location you dare to explore. Good night, and keep the lights on